Eight, six, five, four, three, two, one. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. Or welcome back to the Festival of Revolutions for anyone that's been at a talk already. This is the Cultures of Resistance stage, and today we have Aet Annist joining us. If just to kind of like get everyone landing in the room, just pop in the chat where you are so that we have a bit of an idea of everyone's locality. Welcome, everyone. So this festival is obviously bringing people together, and that's so that we can bring together ideas, connect with each other. So we really encourage that during this talk. Like if you feel to connect with other people in the chat, like share details, please go ahead. Um, and the festival's about being inspired, and it's designed for your ongoing learning. So if you haven't got a notebook with you, then I recommend it. Um, Without delay, it's my delight to introduce this morning's talk, Malleable Humans, Stubborn Systems, Why Change is So Hard and Can Something Be Done About It? Dr. Aet Annist is an associate professor in the Department of Ethnology at the University of Tartu. I think I'm saying that correctly. Forgive me if I'm not. In Estonia. She came of age as the Soviet Union collapsed, and she spent her academic career thinking about change, both analytically as an anthropologist focusing on development and post-socialism and neoliberal fragmentations, and practically as a climate activist, mender, and forager. The focus of her research for the last 10 years has been climate and environmental social ties, as these emerge from a variety of activist and adaptive groups. In today's session, we're going to explore how, despite growing awareness of the climate crisis and clear evidence that humans are capable of change, meaningful transformation often feels frustratingly out of reach. Why do we remain stuck? This session will be interactive, so feel free to jump in and connect and bring forward your questions. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Aet. Aet, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much. I think maybe compared to the previous sessions and further sessions, this will probably be slightly more academic. My hand has been forced, and I will be making it more interactive, but it still remains sort of more like an academic intro to some of the ideas and some of the concepts that surround this topic. And I'm going to share my slides. Let's hope that it works. I think I've got the right one. Okay, so let me know if it doesn't come up. Is it there? I can't see it
You're
yet.
good. Yeah, we can see it.
You can see it.
Mhm.
Brilliant. Okay. So can you still see it, just in case, because I sometimes have problems with.
We can
It's still
still see it.
visible. Yeah.
You're all good.
Excellent. Okay. Great. 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 Okay. So yeah, so as I said, the session has been kind of advertised as interactive, and I think meaningful change can only arise from efforts to do things together, for better or for worse. So hopefully this will work. Hopefully this will be a little bit of a practice as well for me, maybe as well as an academic. We tend to not maybe share and interact as much as we should. But my work has been around these kinds of more, just concentrating on how humans share or don't share, and how they function as social animals, or maybe don't function so well in certain circumstances. So I'm primarily picking out a number of issues that have actually been all put in the title pretty much, and steer clear of my own sort of main research topics, but I will hope that maybe some of your questions or some of your responses will bring more topics into it. But I'll start by saying that to figure out that question in the title, why change is so hard, we need to understand whether it's intrinsic to humans. And actually, when we think of a lot of the kind of old adages that we hear about humans, it often tends to be that human nature never changes, that we're wired to be greedy or selfish or biologically incapable of long-term thinking and so on. So this sounds like a suggestion that humans are pretty rigid and kind of biologically or psychologically determined creatures which can't change. And yet, there is plenty of archaeological and present evidence that human species is extremely malleable, extremely ready for change. And in fact, when we think about human species, then responding flexibly to change as individuals, but also as social groups, appears to be our trademark. I mean, it has enabled us to colonize all of the Earth, which has required us to adjust and adapt to quite a lot of different circumstances and build a life around this. So we have had to kind of adjust to conditions that have shaped us physically and mentally and socially. So just to force us to be more interactive, force me to interact, and not that it's a problem, but you know it's not something that's not necessarily that easy. I wanted to throw. I can't actually see my own slides, which is very bizarre. Yeah, I changed the slide. Is this okay now? You can see it.
Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah, we can see it. Excellent. Okay, so I was going to just ask, maybe you can either pop in the chat or say out loud, because you have the capacity to turn on your microphones, whether you can think of any change that you personally have adapted to, any change where this kind of some circumstances have forced you to change, and you have responded to a changed circumstance with being able to adapt to it. People are escaping instead. All right, leaving go and going to university. Very good. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's quite a big change very often. Repetitive strain injury. Yes. Oh, marriage. Absolutely. Language. Yeah. Oh, I can relate to so many of these, including the repetitive strain injury. Yeah, and England is a difficult place to adapt to. I mean, the way that you English use language and tease and all of that is very difficult to accept when you come from a country which isn't maybe so forthright with kind of invading people's minds with that kind of teasing and so on. So anyway, so this is another one. Brilliant. Okay, so in some ways, we had one more. Understanding climate emergency changed everything for me. Yeah. Oh gosh, we have so many interesting inputs. I'm trying to see them quickly. Okay. Couldn't see. Some of them came at the sort of pace which allowed me to see them, but now they're coming. They're flying in. Something exactly. These relationships are often trauma responses. It's a very deep one, right? But what I'm seeing here is in fact that we can change. Humans are very capable of changing. We are extraordinarily adaptable. I mean, something comes along and we will find a way to live through this. In other words, this is something very natural to us. So we adjust with relative ease to these sort of changing circumstances. And sometimes it's very fast, sometimes it takes more time. But human adaptability is our main feature. So we are biologically and neurologically extremely plastic. We are culturally open-ended. We are able to respond to environmental change and environments that we create as well. I mean, I guess one of the major changes recently is we're responding to the environment of being within the kind of digital world. And also, the history shows that we are self-transforming. We transform ourselves, and along with it, we transform our societies. So we adjust with relative ease to various kinds of circumstances. We adjust to positive change, such as, let's say, digital world as well. I mean, it does have very negative aspects to it, but it's also positive, and we are able to adjust to it. In the case of very difficult circumstances, as studies of disasters and wars demonstrate, we are able to respond, even if it's sort of taking a toll on our mental and physical lives, and yet we somehow cope. And also our social structures are able to respond, even with great urgency and great shocks. So we are changing these social structures to take on the change. Following hurricanes, earthquakes, people come together to support each other, even when they didn't do it maybe before that. They create bonds, they overcome at least some degree the kind of usual social restrictions. When we think of wars, they create an entirely new social and structural reality, which is highly unstable, requiring sort of constant adjustment, constant adaptation, and also acceptance from the members of society. Maybe if we didn't accept wars, maybe they would be short-lived, but this is how we go through this. As demonstrated by Ukraine war or Sudanese war, take whichever one that you know better. People find ways to function in these completely upended realities, and they provide and protect themselves, but also they help others. Or during COVID, of course, we adjusted to a totally different way of functioning in the society. Our workplaces and our schools, our social lives, on the one hand, we kind of withdrew, our social lives shrunk. And at the same time, we were also able to form this kind of neighborhood groups who were helping neighbors who maybe we were completely indifferent to before. We may have not even changed one word with our neighbors, and suddenly we found a way to come and help those who we didn't really know at all before that kind of a shock. So we are able to absorb these positive changes. We're able to switch between different ways of ordering our own daily life and allowing newness into it. So indeed, whether or not we worry about change, or whether or not we fear change, we do go along with it, almost as a daily practice. And thus rises the question, why are we faced with incredible obstacles where change is necessary or even existential? When we know that there are great risks on the horizon, why do we simply not choose to change in order to prevent these risks becoming a reality? So humans are, after all, also, like as any surviving species, relatively risk averse. So should we not be wary of risks rather than immune to them? Should we not adjust to make sure that we avoid these risks becoming reality? And yet the world appears unchanged despite this sort of increasingly urgent demand for change. Why is it that change becomes so difficult when it threatens the systems that we depend on, is actually the question that we need to consider. And again, to move on to another little moment of interaction, what do you think? What prevents climate action? What would your suggestions be? I'm looking at the. See some very interesting other comments already from before. Yeah. Oh dear. Okay. So any suggestion? Fear. Mm-hmm. Indeed. Stubbornness, personal sacrifice, life gets in the way, yeah, very much. Lobbyism, that's an interesting one. Entrenched positions of power and wealth, which we sometimes also hold, but it's often other people's positions that attack us, exactly. Yeah, capitalism, it's too overwhelming. Yeah. Very nice, it's not immediate enough, precisely. Being uninformed. New technologies might be something which just seem unknown. Oh, I lost the track now. Power structures. Bullying by the legal system. Another one very interesting. Lack of infrastructure. Yeah, that's a very, very interesting one, important one, and potentially one of those which is perhaps easier to change thinking, how do we create infrastructures of knowledge? How do we know? At the moment, it seems that there is too much knowledge. Right, difficult to see how, exactly. Yeah, so we can sort of see that there are this huge number of different reasons we can see why we get stuck. And maybe we'll just look at a couple of theoretical explanations why this happens to understand these reasons that you've listed, which seem to broadly be categorizable into groups such as emotional and psychological, but also social and structural, economic, systemic. It would be quite interesting to look at that row of terms afterwards and see which ones do we recognize more and which ones maybe don't come to mind so easily. So it's already becoming an potentially interesting source of knowledge for us to see what we see as the reasons for this kind of stuckedness. But yeah, so let's look at risks and systems within which we have to function. And indeed, as somebody already mentioned, we are wired for change, as I said, but it is to avoid immediate risks. So if it's not immediate enough, then it's difficult. We are avoiding immediate and often personal risks, but we do struggle recognizing and responding to risks which are abstract or seem abstract, which are systemic and which are long-term. And climate and ecological collapse is definitely one of those. So a very complex and delayed from the human sort of life cycle point of view and global threats is often ignored or deprioritized. There is this interesting American social psychologist, John Jost, who has developed what's known as system justification theory. There's a number of other theorists who have developed this, but I wanted to pick him out in particular because he explains how people tend to defend the status quo even if it's harmful. And they do that because it provides a sense of stability and psychological safety. So these emotional reasons that you mentioned are probably kind of related to this need for a sense of stability and psychological safety. People are motivated to defend existing social systems even when those systems harm them, because these systems provide them with some very essential things, such as predictability. Often identity is a very vital thing that systems provide us with. It provides us with social belonging, and also it reduces this kind of existential anxiety. Am I safe in this environment? And that's more important than understanding that, well, the system is maybe undermining my safety. So people often protect the systems not because the systems work well for them, but because uncertainty is so frightening that they're not going to challenge this system which has provided them with a seeming safety, at least so far. So our greater capacity for adaptability is often redirected towards preserving the system. So we're adapting in order to preserve the system rather than transforming it. So we can't do the adaptation and system changing at the same time. So it seems scary and we'll avoid it. There is another valuable theory which I think I think it's quite vital here to understand, or maybe sort of adds another layer to understanding these ways of avoiding change. And that comes from British anthropologist Mary Douglas, who has put forward cultural risk theory. And this argues that societies interpret and respond to risk based on their social norms and values, not based on objective threat levels. So we don't evaluate risks so much objectively, but rather we perceive the risks according to what the social organization or the moral order or the group and cultural worldview proposes is the risk. So the risk perception doesn't equal actual danger, but instead it's culturally filtered danger. So for instance, we may perceive the risk of terrorist threats as worth responding to collectively by, for instance, accepting surveillance at the airports or even on the streets. But we do not accept air pollution as a risk in the name of which we give up, for instance, driving cars that easily. So societies select based on a number of different ongoing issues which dangers matter. And these may not appear actually very consistent with the reality, or in particular with a longer view. There is a number of other risk theorists who could be brought in. Of course, Ulrich Beck is one of the most well known, but I'm not going to go into his theory. But instead, I was going to ask you if you can think of harmful systems that people defend, which you have come across, because they feel familiar, these systems, or because their risks are downplayed. I mean, obviously, we can think of our own society at first, but maybe something more specific. Can you think of something? And if so, then put it in the chat. Let me see. Open comments, yes. I can see there is an interesting question from Annabelle, but I'm just I can get in. Why people don't self-refer to their immorality and ethics. How interesting. Do you want to open this a little bit, just to hear other voices except mine? I think people's brains will switch off eventually.
Yeah, so my question is why people don't self-refer to their own morality and ethics in terms of what they choose to respond to, or what they use acceptable and unacceptable, and why it seems to me that it's like social movement that advocate change, as opposed to like individuals self-referring to like driving the car and air pollution. Actually, air pollution is really bad, but like in reference to what you just said about surveillance and air pollution, that came up for me.
I'll come briefly to this actually in a moment. So what else do we have here? Yeah, getting used to. I mean, obviously, yes, eating meat, indeed, a good example. Installing new the half information they think harmful. Yes, that's another. Do you mean preventing installing this? Yes, I'm guessing. Yeah.
So basically, like there is
Yeah.
a lot of half lies about solar panels taking space, removing ability to grow food, windmills killing birds, etc.
Right. Interesting. Yes. So half information is an important reason for this. Couldn't connect my house to heaters and heat pumps. Yes, exactly. Lacking experience. I mean, again, unfamiliarity. Something which is unfamiliar is definitely always something which we hesitate about. Education system, very good. Yeah, nationalist kind of supremacy and these kinds of landlordism. That's an interesting term. I like that. Yeah, the state. I absolutely agree. Profit-oriented economy. Right, exactly. Yeah. So before I go into this theory, I want to come back to this question about both meat eating, but also this sort of self-referring to their morality and so on. It's related to the I think quite widely known idea of cognitive dissonance, which is basically the situations where people's values, for instance, sustainability, clash with their lifestyle. So, for instance, traveling by planes, consuming meat, and so on. And this dissonance is often resolved not by changing behavior, but instead rationalizing what we do. This idea comes from Leon Festinger from already 1950s, but it's been developed and used massively because it is such a human characteristic which seems to not change. it seems to be there and take the shape of whatever is happening in the world, and we are constantly in cognitive dissonance and try to solve it by rationalizing why we do something. So, for instance, our love for animals clashes with meat eating, so we explain it away to ourselves by distinguishing animals to those who are pets and those who are edible, basically, or we are closing our eyes to the reality of meat production and so on. But what I would like to concentrate on, and partly it comes from the fact that I'm an anthropologist, but partly also I think we need to move away from this kind of psychological determinism, which is possible from this understanding, or concentrating on something like cognitive dissonance as a psychological mechanism. What is important to understand is, although this mechanism is on some level psychological, it is in fact directly shaped by our shared social reality. So when we fool ourselves, it's more than a psychological process, and we need to avoid this determinism and understand what are the other mechanisms here. So I propose to use instead cognitive sociologist Aet, who suggests that even our most basic mental habits are social, as are all kind of social boundaries or categories or partitions with which we live. And Zerubbabel relates this to also to silences and denial in the society. And in his book, which is called The Elephant in the Room, from 2006, he considers collective denial in the society in particular. He considers this collective denial as a socially organized silence. And this could be anything. I mean, it could start from domestic violence or the need for climate action. We know that something needs to be done, and yet we avoid acknowledging or properly tackling these issues. So Zerubbabel notes that this silence is collective, it is socially coordinated. It would be socially awkward or embarrassing to cross what he calls mental fences. And it's these mental fences that kind of surround certain topics and maybe surround us. And they prevent us from, for instance, barging in and announcing that we all need to change right now into, I don't know, into a class or a situation where everybody else is talking about something else, but this is something which is in our minds. We have suddenly realized that this is the most important thing that we need to address. But we don't, because it's usually socially embarrassing. And as social animals, we carefully avoid losing our social face, so we stay silent instead. So Zerubbabel reframes silence from this kind of internal decision, psychological decision, to an active collective process. And as such, when we recognize that this is this kind of active collective process which we all contribute to in one way or the other, it can be brought to the surface, it can be examined and challenged. So this should allow us to directly address also complicity and moral responsibility. I mean, obviously Zerubbabel, who is himself of Israeli origin, has written in the early 2000s. I wonder what he has said or would have said about the silences that have emerged in the current climates of wars and genocides. I wanted to just briefly, I think maybe just show of hands whether you can discuss climate collapse honestly in everyday life. Just, I don't know if I can see if you're showing, I don't know even how this would interactively work. Lizard brain. No. Yeah. Anybody who wants to put a yes? Or, oh, okay, exactly. Only a row of no's. And even those who say yes, and I mean, I do tend to talk about it as soon as I can. I mean, maybe not climate collapse, but climate change. With anybody, I sit down in a cab and start telling the cab driver how great, how much better is a cab compared to a private car or whatever, and then I manage to sometimes get to the climate issues. But indeed, it doesn't often lead to collapse topics, and it definitely can't be done in every situation. It definitely can't be done with everyone. And that silence is socially produced, that inability to address it honestly and directly in all sorts of situations, even though it is going to affect us in all sorts of situations, and is going to affect everyone, but yet we can't talk about it. And now I want to just go through a number of interesting ethnographic examples, which I would like to stress are not about deniers, but rather about the particular social mechanisms that enable denial. And I saw, Alexander, you mentioned this sort of lizard brain people. Often there is something about their social environment which hopefully explains their lizard brain. When we recognize that people do stupid things and think in silly ways because they are social and because their social circumstances guide them that direction, then maybe we can be a little bit more forgiving to those lizards as well and recognize that there is a monkey on top of the lizard, there may be even a human somewhere there. So there are many ethnographies of such silences, and it's interesting to see that there is increasingly a number of ethnographies of denial, specifically in relation to climate change. And then here is a number of authors, and I put these names here so that you could perhaps look them up. I mean, I could have put the whole list of titles, but that seemed to take too much space. So hopefully these names will help you find the titles. I do mention the titles as well, so hopefully you can pick it up. So first is Kari Norgard's ethnographic work on rural Norwegians who acknowledge climate change. And at the time of her fieldwork, these villages, the village she calls Bugdlaby, and the villagers have just had an experience of a winter where the first snowfall came 2 months later than usual. As a result, the ice fishing was impossible. The ski industry, which locals depended on as well, had to invest substantially to artificial snowmaking. So there is no denying that there is a change, that there is climate change, and yet the people do not act on this substantial change. So she says this shows how the kind of social norms and emotional self-protection and cultural narratives that they live with, how this creates inertia. Knowing that the contradiction even exists, so they even recognize that there is a contradiction, doesn't help. So global warming was for them both common knowledge, but also socially unimaginable. And although they perceived this inconsistency, maintaining social normality in daily life was paramount. So this kind of denial of the need to change is socially organized, and that's another example of this. There is an Australian ethnography coming from Vanessa Bowden, Daniel Newberg, and Christopher Wright, who describe a very complicated case from some sort of coastal areas in Australia, and they call this planning for the past. So I suggest you could look it up. And they are describing this situation where people are literally living on floodplains. They are entirely aware that these areas can and will be flooded. But where this becomes particularly interesting is when they are experiencing rising insurance premiums and declining property prices. They're not putting it down the reason to be in climate change. Instead, they are seeing the problem as a result of this kind of unfair administrative label of being a flood zone. So rather than looking at, these floodplains are becoming uninhabitable inevitably, I can't imagine that this is going to be insured, and let's do something about climate change, instead they are focusing on the local government labeling them as flood zones. Now another one from Alex Arnall and Chris Hilson, coming from closer to the UK, sorry, I can't remember the exact place now, but somewhere in another kind of coastal area, in a Welsh village that's to be decommissioned and people are to be moved. So this article is called Climate Change Imaginaries, and they are going to be moved because of rising sea levels. But they note how the village is rejecting this reality. So the authors call this a kind of translation zone where global scientific imaginary of climate change meets this sort of local imaginations rooted in experience and these are tied to specific places. So for them, they sort of challenging these claims that there will be enough sea level rise for them to have to move away. And they consider this more important than the scientist's suggestion that, well, I mean, you may be able to push it back a little bit, but not forever. So the residents are resisting council's plans for their community. They scrutinize these through this very intense political interrogation. And of course, this kind of denial of change to avoid change to one's own life, whilst others carry on as before, is also an entirely understandable desire of fairness. Why should my life change while other people's lives don't change? So all of those examples show how the social production of denial and the various ways the reality is obscured and replaced with something else prevents us from responding to reality. We manage to kind of create these blinders which enables us to focus on something else. It guides us to something else, mostly to protect the way that we have been living until now. One more ethnographic example straddles this socially organized denial and the structural realities that ensure that such denialism survives. This comes from Laura Pulido, who describes Oregon wildfires in 2020, where the blame for the fires was put on Black Lives Matter and Antifa activists. So they were suggested, there was this rumors going around that it was them who had started the fires. And again, it was focused on that rather than the cause which actually made these fires, which often are human caused, although not deliberately. But what makes them so widespread? What makes them so intense? What spreads them all over the place rather than keeping them contained to where they started? And that is climate change. But instead of thinking about that, they were discussing this sort of political adversaries as the horrible authors of trying to burn the whole of America down. And it's not just any political adversaries, but it's the racialized others, the black people and the activists working with them, as well as the political adversaries, who are threatening the white nation, as Pulido puts it, who are seen as a threat instead. So not climate change, but the threat to the white nation from the non-white population in America. And at the bottom of this, there are these inequalities and perceived unfairness. And again, this forms the kind of background or reason why people's attention stays misfocused, not on climate change, not on environmental harm. And these structural features become blinders, preventing people from seeing the actual causes of danger or catastrophe. In fact, they work as blinders to seeing the systemic failure, or to be even more precise, it blinds the participants in the system to the system being a failure in, for instance, providing humankind with sustainable existence. So let me move on. Now that we have sort of directly focused on the system or structure, let's look at another great study that looks at how systems mask their flaws. And this is a study by Diane Warren titled The Challenger Launch Decision, and it looked at the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster in 1986, where 7 astronauts lost their lives. And she describes how disasters occur not because something suddenly goes wrong, but because of how the various pressures from the system's demands and expectations to the people within them mask the danger in an almost routine way. So Warren argues that it was the structure and mission of NASA as an institution that created this kind of climate where risk was accepted and that resulted in the disaster. So she points at how danger and deviations become normalized became normalized. I'm hoping they learned something from it, as the NASA staff increasingly ignored warning signs. There were deviations from norm in the running up to the launch. But they managed to kind of ignore those deviations for structural reasons, because they needed to get things done quicker. There were budget issues and so on. So these deviations became familiar, and finally they became routine, and thus even increasing deviations weren't picked up, didn't get to be looked at. And such organizational routines enabled this impending catastrophe to be hidden basically in plain sight. And a more recent example, again closer to the UK, is of course Grenfell Tower catastrophe in 2017. And this offers a combination of ignoring the warning signs because of the atmosphere of cost cutting or whatever, and on the other hand, the inequality that is aggravating this issue. The alarm is not triggered, the concern is not raised, because those raising the alarm are ignorable in an unequal society. Constance Smith has recently published an article on Grenfell Tower in particular, and she suggests that failure is constantly recomposed as meaningful action within this kind of very stubborn system, and as a result, the system fails to learn from the faults. The failures re-emerge, the same awful faults keep being reproduced. So all of the above suggests that the system we are living in is not built or maintained or managed in a way that enables recognizing its failure. Indeed, Vaughan points at the kind of structural desire for success as a huge contribution to failure. So as I mentioned already, the kind of institutional priorities such as launch schedules and budgets and political expectations, and they gradually displaced safety concerns. And for those who decided what is alarming in the case of the tower cladding in Grenfell Tower's case, money mattered more than lives, and the rest of the systems were not holding those people accountable who were making these decisions. And we could perhaps say that climate change is a civilization scale case of normalization of deviance, what Vaughan is proposing. So these institutions and cultures can normalize escalating danger and systemic or indeed systems failure. So in short, a system resists change because it's designed to. It's meant to stay the way it is. I mean, making it constantly able to change is perhaps a problem. And we go along as these systems also provide us with the comforting ways to live, and it's comfortable and easy to deny a very inconvenient truth, and that we need to change. But we are not swallowed up by these systems. We can analyze how power operates, and we can do that with the aim of understanding how to overcome these structural and other constraints to achieve change. After all, changes have happened, systemic changes have happened, systems have changed. I have lived through one of those changes myself. I was, as I mentioned or Annabelle mentioned in the beginning, I came of age. I mean, I was an adult when the Soviet system collapsed. So I saw the process towards this. I remember how the society moved closer to the revolution, basically. I mean, we had something called singing revolution, obviously not exactly terrifying sounding to those holding on to a system. But in any case, it was a total change from one system to the other. And the system did tumble down in front of me. I wondered if any of you might have experiences with societal change, profound societal change, or maybe slightly less profound. What kind of is assuming that you have. Well, I'm not assuming, but if you have, or if you think that something which you have lived through might be more or less or be similar, then please pop it here. Brexit, yeah, pretty thorough in many ways. Suspicious of science being used against them, yeah. I'm wondering if that means that science has lived through a change, because this definitely is the case that science was kind of immune and now it's being constantly challenged. Maybe it was a response to something. There are some people who have lived through the Germany's reunions and so on. Removal of workshop leaders. That's something very interesting. I'm not sure what this refers to. I don't know if you want to come in and say what you mean by this. Different approach to capitalism, change from country from, I can't see, sorry, from China. Okay. That's an interesting one too. Okay, there's one more. Current master rests, yes. It's a pretty profound change, even if the whole system isn't changing, but it's a mortifying change that this is becoming normalized and accepted. For those of you who are maybe talking about something which is maybe not as problematic and more kind of more positive, let's put it that way, and maybe more structural, what became politically possible, for instance, in the case of German unification, that wasn't before? I mean, I don't know if you can quickly, on the top of your head, think of something, but I encourage you to think about that. Obviously, COVID is a very good example. Certainly, our political leaders, who were Tories at the time, were doing very un-Tory-like things, and were kind of able to find money to create social support, at least to some degree, and for a period of time, which wouldn't have been without that very profound change, even if short-lived otherwise. Yeah. Okay. Well, that one was a little bit a bit more challenging, but I think what we can definitely derive from the fact that systems do change is that if paralysis, inertia is socially organized, as we saw before, then action can also be, or has to be, socially organized. In one of the large-scale projects that I'm involved in, which is called Co-Sustain, it's a Horizon Europe funded project, we are trying to understand how change emerges by looking at small-scale niche-level actions, of which this event today is full. You know, we can see so many interesting niche-level actions. And we are trying to observe how these are accepted or adopted on the regime level, and finally how they become part of a sort of broader landscape that defines the features of a system. And an interesting example, I mean, there's an Estonian example, but we are a slightly different case, because we're looking at how the system itself, or the regime level itself, is involved in this change. But others are looking at this completely niche level initiatives. For instance, in Spain, there are these energy communities which have risen completely locally, and our Spanish colleagues are trying to understand how these models are now affecting the regime level and forcing Spanish state to take them into consideration and adjust the way that the certain sort of energy provision aspects function in the state, and from that it might become a kind of normal landscape level reality of providing renewable energy to your own community and benefiting from, which wasn't possible before. When we look at how change and crisis unfolded during the Soviet end years, then the regime level was just as rigid and unwilling to change as today's capitalism. But interestingly, beneath that regime during the Soviet years, and I remember that as a child, something was brewing on that niche level. And one of the elements of that was criticism of the power. It was this sort of kitchen table laments. I remember my mother, of course, with her friends, how they were sitting around and just constantly criticizing the system, saying all sorts of things that were wrong. And that was repeated from one table and one little Soviet apartment to another. Of course, it never reached anywhere, as there was no way such critique of the system would have been in the newspapers. but nevertheless, it was there, and it kept alive this sort of sense that this is not right, this system is not right, it's an oppressive and in many ways wrong system. It's a totally different topic, what happened afterwards. We might not be able to get there today, but yeah, just to put it out there. Today, we see again a very intense critique of the regime, of the state, of those in power. It doesn't necessarily put the finger in the right place often. Also, the obstacles are different. I think we probably didn't put our fingers in the right place why the Soviet system didn't function well, but nevertheless, it was there. So one of the obstacles today, of course, is that this critique of the system is often very distorted. It takes forms such forms as fascism. It has, it comes in the form of conspiracy theories. Also, there are oligarchs who are supporting such discourses to be as much in newspapers and in the public as possible. So this is in some ways quite different. But at the same time, I think what matters is that the critique is there, and that is a start. It has also become louder and it has become different. It differs quite markedly, for instance, from the 90s or even early 2000s. So the crises that capitalism has plunged into since 2007 has in that sense changed the picture, has started to expose that there is something systemically wrong. And another interesting parallel is the creation of communities. In the Soviet case, the failures of the Soviet system, there were lots of different failures, daily failures, meant that people were bound together by the need to respond to for instance, the lack of variety of food in the shop. We had plenty of food, but it was always very, very boring and similar, and variety was a problem. Or when a service would fail. So people had to respond to that. And in order to do that, they had to bind together. For instance, there were regular stoppages of hot water in the sleeping districts of Estonian capital Tallinn, to which people responded by arranging bathing parties. So they would visit their friends or relatives in the area where the hot water was still available, have a shower or a bath, but also socialize, and that's quite crucial. So these kinds of moments of community making were also keeping alive exactly this kind of critique and this constant analysis of how wrong this system is, and increasingly throughout the 80s, also different specific tactics how to take this to the streets. I mean, in the 80s, the kind of street level protests started and became more and more pronounced and numerous. So indeed, we can say that this kind of crisis mode in which the Soviets lived was not just building communities, but it was also on such level that we could say that crisis in the Soviet system was common. The crisis experience was shared. And because of that, it was plain for everyone to see. As we saw from the Grenfell example, as well as Pulido's example, today's crises are often uncommon. They're not shared. So there are some groups, the usual sacrifice zones, sacrificed populations, they suffer, and others can prolong the system's sort of seeming functioning because they're not really touched by this. And perhaps this might be one of those moments where we could consider whether there are features of the present crisis or crises, or its precursors in case it hasn't led to a visible crisis, which help us connect to others. So on the one hand, it could be in the form of finding solutions together to these crises, but also finding ways to reach across the dividing lines. And also by reaching out beyond our usual comfort zones to connect over the annoyance at the crises with people who maybe are our political adversaries. Maybe we can explore the motivations and results of a very practical issue together. And that would create pathways to change to which we can take along somebody who is actually blinded to the systemic and structural issues that have created the problems that they have responded to politically or otherwise very differently. And this brings me to another experience, not so much from the Soviet, but rather the post-Soviet collapse. And that's where some people's lives were completely destroyed as a result of the Soviet collapse. People lost work or even any chance of finding work, especially in the rural areas. And they often have remained in that crisis mode. So as a result, they have held on to the skills of functioning in a crisis, which often many of us have lost. I mean, we have never had them, or our parents have never had them. Sometimes, of course, these are very unhealthy practices, but nevertheless, their ability or they being forced to live in a crisis, in a personal crisis, has enabled them to function through this continuing crisis in the margins of the society. And this skill of living in crisis is quite remarkable and worth valuing, along with the people who carry these skills. We have them in Estonia, in the post-socialist region. I'm not sure. Maybe there are examples of this in the UK and in the kind of Western world as well. But I think that even if it may be hard to sort of re-comment the crisis, at least not urgently, what we are able to do is creating these kind of pockets or niches of commonness. And here, activists in particular have created a flourishing landscape. And I wanted to lead us to maybe a slightly more positive question to come to the end. Have you been part of building niches and or commons? I'm hoping some of what your own experiences or what I have been saying reply already to some of the questions. I can see there are some very practical questions. Annabelle, you have asked again a challenging question. Okay, well, it looks like not many of you have been or don't feel like you've been part of some sort of niche building or commonness building. I think you probably have and maybe don't recognize this. So I propose, for instance, repair cafes are an interesting example where commonness is being built. Community gardens, tenants organizing all sorts of energy co-ops, food distribution practices, even climate grief groups, any kind of climate action and climate activism will have also provided us. I mean, that's one of the remaining XR kind of gifts, I suppose, that it has left behind lots of groups of people who do things together, sometimes not anymore under the XR banner, but nevertheless. So, these groups and environments that are emerging within which this sort of newly found and worrying clarity of the system's failures is not rejected. I mean, these people are recognizing, they're sort of together understanding that this is happening. It's not shunned. Talking about climate change, for instance, you don't need to feel that this is behind a fence. Instead, it's supported. These groups are providing explanatory structures, different elements that enable action, skills and knowledge how to act. And in many ways, it is, of course, the space where you acquire agency to challenge and expose these stagnant structures and their failures. And also these are spaces where we can experiment with different alternative, non-conformist, innovative, or even revolutionary ways of reorganizing the society. These groups are prefigurative. They're the groups that prefigure the life post next collapse. And they include also, in addition to what I already mentioned, maybe more profoundly, the deep adaptation groups, eco-villagers, degrowthers, but also forager groups who are quite focused on turning humans to keystone species that we used to be at some point. There is a very interesting study, or many studies by now, which suggest that Amazon rainforest is created by nomadic humans who left plants which were beneficial to them all over the place, and upsprung this huge, incredible, again a gift, I suppose, to the world. So we have been quite good at doing valuable things, and we can do it again. We can become guerrilla gardeners, we can be the learners of all sorts of skills. I just went to a local park where I have my little secret trees that I have planted there. This is something very easy to do, and you are contributing to something which you might not see yourself. I don't think that I will see them grow very big, but still. And this sort of dedication to practicing sharing and meaningful, lasting relations is clear on the ideological level and during the meetings. But most importantly, it's sort of enabling these spaces which make us able to respond also to the crises, which in the end are moments where change becomes possible. We can unwrite the story that we've been told, that we don't change and the systems cannot change. So we will be prepared with knowledge and these sort of little ways of thinking about the next steps to respond when the opportunity arises, and contribute to making this opportunity a reality. So I want to, I finish here, but I want to leave you with this little question that you can type in the chat, or you can just think for yourself. What is the one thing you might want to make more socially normal or acceptable after today? It could be just recognizing these social obstacles that we have, and their social nature, and maybe become more forgiving to those who appear to us to go wrong in understanding the processes. But nevertheless, so pop them in the chat, or actual emergency briefing. I'm getting lost. Right. Okay. Thank you so much. I will finish here.
Thank you, Aet, and thank you for the great question that you ended that with. It's a good one for us to take away.
Thank you.
Will you be going to the connection space now, Aet, just in case anyone wants to continue conversation with you?
I will briefly go there. I am going out with my family to see some more plants.
Oh, wonderful. Well,
but yeah, I will be there briefly if I find it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Aet. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Take care, all of you.
Bye.
Bye.